Hello and welcome to another Magic Leap developer tutorial. Today we're going to be speaking about headlocked content and user interface. We're going to take some headlocked content, some UI as a menu to put in front of our user so that they can click and start the application, and then we're also going to create some world space UI on our controller so that you can select 4 different objects to place in the world. Generally, we would advise UI to be in the world space, within the 3D space around us, but sometimes you need some really good headlocked content for really key information to the user, such as instructions, onboarding, or the very start menu of your application. So let's get started and jump into Unity. So here we are where we left off in the Unity editor. We're going to right click, go on UI and create a new canvas. You can see here we can swap between 2D mode and 3D mode by clicking that 2D button. And now we're going to render it in the world space instead of screen space and pull in the main camera, which is going to be the active camera, and scale along the X, Y, and Z axis to 0.01. And then on the width and the height, it's going to be 160 by 120. And this just matches the aspect ratio of 4:3 of the device, which you can see here in the game view. Then we're going to go on UI and we're going to text Mesh Pro. Now if you don't have text Mesh Pro installed, you need to go to Window, the package manager, and install text Mesh Pro. You can see I have it installed here. Next, enter 2D mode, and we can see we can scale now the bounding area of the text and scale it down to fit within our canvas. So we don't want it to be at the very edges, we want to scale it down and make sure it's within the center. We'll scale the text down and make sure that it's central to our view. We can put in something like, hello, press play to start, and then we'll have an icon that we click with our raycast on our controller to interact with it. So we'll go to UI and we're going to go on button, text Mesh Pro button, and this is going to be actually what we use to interact. So I'll pull in a new icon, which is this like play button icon. That's part of the SDK. Rescale it down, and I'm going to remove the text because I don't really need that now. The whole point of the icon is that we recognize that it's a play icon. So if we just press play now and saw what's actually meant to be happening, the UI would just stay there in the world, not move around, not have any interaction. So what we want to do is actually lock it to the head pose. Now we only really do this if it's a very critical piece of information for the user, such as onboarding or some options or something like this. So I'm going to put on this head pose canvas script, which basically just lerps the world's canvas in front of the camera at whatever speed you want. You can see it horizontally or vertically, and places it a certain distance away. So I'm just going to rename this head pose canvas. I've got the script attached now to the canvas. And when I press play, you can see here through device stream that as I move around, as I'm doing my meshing, the canvas is locked to my head pose, but it isn't locked one for one. It's got this really nice lerping motion, and it kind of catches me up where I'm looking. You can see here when I'm pointing my raycast, which we developed in another video, it's not interacting with the icon. So that's what we're going to fix now. Normally we might use the Unity event system for UI interaction, but in this case we're not going to. We're going to add a box collider onto the icon and scale it up quite a lot. You can see it's really small here. So we're going to scale it up along each axis to like 75. And now you can see that we've got this box collider here, and that's what the raycast is going to interact with. So I'm just going to rename this start button, capital S, capital B, because we're going to check in our script against the name start button when we raycast into it. Now let's create a manager script and put it onto, say, a manager game object. So this is where all of our our one script for our UI management is going to be. So let's create this script here and open it up in Visual Studio. What's always key as well to make sure that any empty game object we create, let's set it back to 000 so we know where it is in the world and it's not getting lost. So here we are in our script. We're going to say including the xr.magicleap and also using Unity Engine.ui, so including those namespaces, and as well as Text Mesh Pro, so using TM Pro. Then we're going to create a reference to the Magic Leap controller input controller. We're going to say we're going to get a game object, head locked canvas, and also the controller input, so where our beam is. Please do note, as of SDK 24, it is now mlinput.controller due to an API change. In start, we're going to say mlinput.start and make a reference to controller with mlinput.getController, mlinput.hand.left. Now in update, we're going to get the trigger value. So the trigger value is between 0 and 1. So if controller.trigger value is greater than, say, 0.5, so between half the squeeze, then we're going to shoot a raycast. So if physics raycast, and it's going to source from the controller input transform position. So where our beam starts, it's going to go forward. So from the controller input transform forward, out infinitely, and then it's going to check if the hit is a game object called start button, and then we're going to call the method start app. And right now, start app just turns off the head pose canvas. So we're saying click on this and turn itself off, and then we can go to our main application. And then quickly private void on destroy mlinput.stop, just to turn off the input when we stop the application. So now let's go to our game object with the script on. We need to place head pose canvas in there, and we also need to put controller input from where our beam stems from. Now when we press play, we can see here in device stream, as we move around, we'll get our text to pop up. The dynamic beam will react to the box collider, and then now I can press my trigger and it will turn itself off, so I can carry on with whatever I want my application to do. So great, so just in a few minutes, we've managed to input some UI, place it in the world, attach a headlocked canvas, and also interact with it with our controller, with the dynamic beam, and also the trigger to turn it off. Next up, what I want to do is place some UI on the controller here so that we can select 4 different objects from the controller to place in the world, because right now we only have 1. So we're going to create a new canvas on controller, and we can see here it's selection canvas, and before we're going to set it to be world space and give it that camera. We're going to scale it right down to be 0.05 on each of the axes, and we can see here the size of it, set it back to be 0, 0, 0, and we can see where it is in relation to the controller. I'm going to try and scale this down a little bit more, say 0.001. And we can see here that's a pretty decent size, and set that to 160 by 120 again, matching the aspect ratio. We're going to rotate it around so it matches where the touchpad is, because we're going to be using the touchpad for the input here. We're going to create some text. I'm going to place it in the top left, top right, bottom left, and bottom right of the touchpad. So we're going to use the touchpad as a selection tool to pick different objects to place in the world. So let's place these here, scale them down nicely, make it quite readable with white text, I often find. And we're going to quickly put in, say, rockets. That's our first object. And we'll put in a submarine, a parrot, and an orchid as well. So these just are pre-made assets that are built into the SDK for some of our examples. It's just a lot nicer than putting in primitive objects such as spheres and cubes and cylinders. And it's a really nice way to show off what you've done today. So I'm just going to rename these so it's a bit more obvious. So rocket text, submarine text, orchid text, and parrot text. It's always really, really helpful to keep your hierarchy very clean and very obvious to what you're building, because you never know when you might be sharing it, or maybe you go back to a project after a long time and it helps you remember what these assets are called, or even what some of your variables are called in your script. So let's go back here to our script, and we're going to create a public game object. It's going to be our controller UI, say a controller canvas, sorry. And then we're going to create another game object, and this is going to be an array of objects and another array of text. So we want to have 4 objects that we can place in the world and 4 pieces of text that want to change color. So in start, we're going to turn off the controller canvas at start. So we don't want to see it when we see our first menu canvas. And we're going to say avoid update touchpad. And we're going to get controller.touch1 active. So are we touching the touchpad? We're going to create an X, Y, Z value and get the X, Y, and Z value of touch 1 position and force of the controller. So X and Y is a value between -1 and 1, and force is a value between 0 and 1 for the force sensitivity of the touch. And now we're going to get these X and Y values to get the 4 different segments of the touchpad. So it's top left, top right, bottom left, and bottom right. And this will allow the user, using their thumb on the touchpad, to select different areas to be able to select those game objects to place them in the world. So you can see here we're just using the X and Y values between -1 and 1 and getting that volume within the touchpad to say which area am I selecting. And now when we're actually selecting in the area, we're going to pass in the game object that we've selected into the previous script we called place object. So we'll go controller input.get component. We're getting the place object component, which is a script, and we're setting the object to place to be the object in the array, not 1, 2, or 3. To give the user a bit of feedback about what they've actually selected, we're going to change the color of the text of the area we've selected as well. So we're going to say the object's text, and it's going to be 0 in the array. Get component, text mesh pro UGUI, we'll change the color to be red. And we also want to make sure that every other text is set white. So we can see here, the first object in the array is going to be set as red. 1, 2, 3 is going to be set as white. And then we alternate that in the rest of the other segments, so it's always matching up to the one that we're selecting. And then in startup, we want to say controller canvas.set enabled is true. So we enable that now when we've started the application and removed headlock canvas. And we're also going to make sure that we're also updating the touchpad in the update. Back to the game object, we now have the various different objects and also the text to put into the empty slots. So there are the different text slots, and now we want to go to the objects and we need to create these objects. So we've got the rocket ship already pre-made. We're going to search for a submarine. We're going to put it into the world, and we need to make this into a prefab variant, but add on the various things such as a box collider, a rigid body, and also set the interaction tab so that we know that we're interacting with an interactive object. Some of these, the box colliders, need to be resized and reshaped. Then we need to add a rigid body so that we can react to the on collider in the previous scripts. Basically setting these objects up as we did the rocket ship in a previous video. We'll make them prefab variants and then we'll pull them in to the slots for the objects on that controller script. Now we can press play. We can see our UI appear on our start screen. We can interact with it. We can pull the trigger to press play, which removes the canvas and brings up our controller canvas on the controller. So we can see here, as I move my thumb to the different segments of the touchpad, they'll change color of the text to say this is the one I've selected. So I can select my rocket or submarine, parrot or orchid. I can place them like before with my bumper button, and because they're all interactable objects, I can now pick them up, scale them, move them around my space. So in under just 15 minutes, we've managed to create 2 different types of UI. First of all, a menu with headlocked content that is an interactable button that we can press that interacts with our raycast. And then UI that sits on our controller that changes color when we select and also powers different object selection that we can then place them in the world. We hope you enjoyed this tutorial. We're always trying to look out for the needs of developers, so please leave comments about what you'd like to see in the future. And as always, we'd love to hear from you on Magic Leap Devs on Twitter. Together, we can build the future.